Now, very shortly, we'll be speaking to Immigration Minister Chris Bowen to get the government's response to that tragic sinking of that boat full of asylum seekers bound for Australia, which sank in Indonesian waters, killing at least 8 people. At least 15 others are still missing. But we'll also be speaking very shortly to the head of the Australian Bankers Association, Stephen Munchenberg, to get his take on the interest rate rise and why those 2 of Australia's 4 major banks that haven't acted yet to lower their rates should do so quickly. We're joined now by Chris Bowen from Canberra. Minister, good morning. Thanks for your time.
Good morning, Michael.
What is the latest information the government has on the search for survivors?
Well, the latest information, and of course we continue to talk to and work with the Indonesian authorities, but it is clear we have tragically at least 6 people dead, including at least 1 child. We have around 20 people still missing. Of course, we believe there are around 70 people on the boat, but it is very difficult to pinpoint the exact number, and the reality is we are unlikely to ever know the exact number of people on the boat, as we've found in these instances before. But this is a great tragedy, Michael, and of course I think all Australians will be thinking today of the victims and their families.
They will indeed. So it's fair to say this is now sadly more of a recovery than a rescue effort.
Look, I think we can tragically assume that many, if not most, of those around 20 people who are missing will be very, very difficult to recover alive.
Are Australian authorities involved at all in that effort?
Well, no, this is an effort very close to Indonesia, so and the Indonesian authorities, to my knowledge, have not requested any assistance. They are perfectly capable of handling a situation such as this. Of course, we talk to them because it's very clear that this boat was heading towards Australia, so we do have a very real and keen interest. But in terms of the rescue, it's something the Indonesian authorities have well under hand.
Now, as you know, the Australian government does work very closely with the Indonesian government to keep track of these boats. What information do you have on whether that boat was being tracked?
Well, this is a boat that was well inside Indonesian waters, although it was very clearly heading towards Australia, as I say, Michael, was well inside Indonesian waters, and obviously I'm not going to comment about specifics of tracking and what we do, but this was a boat that was close to Indonesia, and therefore you can work on the basis, of course, that this was not a boat that had yet come close to Australia, and that the normal arrangements had not yet come into place.
Would you expect it to have been tracked by the Indonesian Navy?
Well, Michael, what the Indonesian Navy was doing was a matter for them. It was a boat, as I say, well inside Indonesian waters, and I'm not able to comment. I have no knowledge about what level of knowledge the Indonesian Navy had about this particular boat.
What information, Minister, does the government have about further boats either heading to Australia or about to launch from other Indonesian ports?
Well, Michael, we've said for some time that we can expect to see an increase in the number of boat arrivals. Of course, we had another one yesterday, a substantial boat of around 90 people on it. I don't comment on intelligence, but we can, or speculation about numbers of boats, but the situation remains that we've said that we could expect more boat arrivals, and that remains our position.
And the way the current policy framework stands, there's nothing to argue against a lot more boats coming very quickly. What is the government going to do about it?
Well, tragically, Michael, we've said consistently, I've said and other government ministers have said that in the absence of the type of arrangements for offshore processing as part of a proper regional framework like Malaysia, the Malaysia arrangements, we would see more boats arriving, and we tragically, inevitably would see more deaths at sea, and it's tragically been proven to be the case. Now, it is the case that offshore processing as part of a proper regional framework is an effective deterrent. The type of arrangement that we negotiated with Malaysia is an effective deterrent, and until and unless we are able to implement that, then we will see more boats arriving. So we'll continue to argue for that, Michael. The practical and legal reality after the High Court case and the failure of the opposition to pass our legislation is that onshore processing is the practical and legal reality. There is no alternative to that, but we will continue to say we could pass legislation today to allow for offshore processing and implement the sort of arrangement we had with Malaysia, and which would allow future governments to implement their arrangements if they wish to, like Nauru, and give the government of the day the ability to implement offshore processing to provide an effective deterrent. We didn't negotiate and argue for and go through all the political pain of the Malaysia arrangement for fun. We didn't do it because we thought it was easy. It was neither of those things. We did it because all the expert advice to us was that this is the way to provide a deterrent for boat arrivals and to stop these tragic deaths at sea.
Now, you make that argument knowing full well the opposition won't support the Malaysia swap deal. The opposition in turn argues your policy approach is flawed. Australians are waking up this morning watching this program and seeing more pictures of people, including children, being dragged from the water. How many more deaths is it going to take for both sides of politics to come to some sort of reasonable compromise?
Well, I think you're right, Michael. I think Australians look to their leaders to sort this out. Both political parties agree with offshore processing, Labor and Liberal. Both political parties agree that done properly, it can provide a deterrent to getting on a boat to Australia and can avoid tragic deaths at sea. Now, I think we've made good faith offers to the opposition. Prime Minister made it very clear that she was happy to make me available to Mr Morrison, for example, to negotiate a mutually agreeable package. Unfortunately, the opposition has said you can have any type of offshore processing you like, providing it's ours, providing it's Nauru. Whereas we've said, well, we believe the Malaysia arrangement is the best opportunity, but we also believe that you should have the power to implement an arrangement like Nauru if you're in power. And Mr Abbott has said, even if the government offered us Nauru, even if the government said that they'd open a detention centre at Nauru, we'd still vote against this legislation if they proceeded with Malaysia, despite all the expert evidence to him that the Malaysia arrangement is the best possible arrangement for stopping people getting on these dangerous boats, for people smugglers to risk people's lives and recklessly and criminally put people onto dangerous boats in dangerous circumstances. And that's why we've been so committed to doing this, and we remain open to talk to the opposition, and the opposition could pass this legislation today. If they told us they'd pass the legislation, we could do that today, and we could have offshore processing, which is the policy of both sides of politics, Labor and Liberal. We could have that implemented.
At the same time, Minister, you reportedly argued in that cabinet meeting that saw the ending of the Malaysia swap deal for Nauru. You argued for the Nauru option, reportedly. Now, given what's happened and given all those political points there you make about the opposition, and given what we're going to see tragically play out in the days ahead as the search continues for bodies in Indonesia, is the government now prepared to look more seriously at Nauru, knowing full well that Malaysia simply won't work?
Well, Michael, let me make a couple of points. Firstly, I don't comment on cabinet meetings, but let me say this. I have argued consistently, publicly and privately, that opening a Nauru detention centre by itself would provide no deterrent to getting on boats. That's all the expert advice to me, and that's what I've argued in every single meeting or discussion I've ever had, and that we should not adopt a Nauru policy simply by itself. And now Mr Abbott has come out and said, look, even if the government offered us to open a Nauru detention centre, we wouldn't pass this legislation. Now, that just shows a lack of regard for the national interest. Now, we continue to say that Nauru by itself would not provide a deterrent, and therefore, why would we adopt a policy which simply would not work?
OK, Immigration Minister Chris Bowen, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Michael.